Thank you, Henrik. So now we are going to talk about magnetic maps in migratory birds, but before we do that, I want to say just a couple of words about bird migration in general. I don't need to say much because Henrik has done it for me already, and he has already shown these. Does it work? I mean, anyway, I can show it physically. I mean, this pattern of northern wheatears migrating from Alaska to northeastern Africa, and I also wanted to show these satellite tracks of godwits that migrate from Alaska to New Zealand non-stop. I mean, these are actual satellite tracks of birds going nearly 11,000 kilometers across the Pacific non-stop without a possibility to land and to rest. It's a feat in endurance flight. It's very interesting how they cope with sleep deprivation, and certainly it's a very important navigation challenge, because if you make a small mistake and miss New Zealand, then evolution will continue without you. And this is just to show you that birds perform incredible things.
Nikita, how long does that take?
Sorry?
How long is that journey?
8 to 9 days,
Right.
non-stop flight, without proper sleep, maybe with hemispheric sleeping in one hemisphere, but we don't know that. And we have talked yesterday, we have discussed yesterday what is a compass and what is a map. And I would like to emphasize that this is an important distinction, because any animal, not just a bird, any animal that moves far beyond its normal home range, and if it wants to get to any specific place, it should have a map or some representation, some mental representation of space. Eric emphasized yesterday that it does not need to be identical to our representation in topographical maps, but there should be some kind of representation of space. And also a compass system which makes it possible to select and maintain a direction. And Henrik has spoken quite a lot about compass systems, and this distinction was, I mean, the conceptual frame was provided by Gustav Kramer, whom Henrik has already mentioned, and these are the only two references that I really spell out in my presentation out of respect to Gustav Kramer, because this was a very important thing. A map and a compass, an animal needs both, and they do not need to be identical in the sense of physical and sensory background. For migrating birds, most students agree that birds have a sun compass, a stellar compass, and a geomagnetic compass, as we have heard from Henrik. And there is less of agreement, but many people think that birds can use a magnetic positioning system or a system or map, an olfactory map, and well, about others I'm not so sure. But it is not impossible that a bird or any other animal uses, say, an olfactory map and a magnetic compass, or a star compass and magnetic map at the same time. So these two systems are certainly have to work in concert, but they do not need to be identical in the physical and sensory sense. And that's why the question, how do migrating animals find their way, which was listed by Science Journal not so long ago as one of the most important, well, one of 125 most important unanswered questions of current natural sciences. This question actually consists of two related but distinct questions. What is the nature of the compass, and what is the nature of the map? And I'm going to speak about the nature of maps or positioning systems in birds. And as I already mentioned, there are two, I would say, less exotic ideas how they do it, and I'm going to speak about the magnetic maps of migrating birds, and Anna Gagliardo is going to present the olfactory component. And yes?
Before you continue, just I see it on your list, you don't have we just discussed at the end of Henrik's talk that the birds migrate, and they have this coarse map that is not a magnetic, Henrik made the point yesterday, the magnetic map cannot be more precise than a few tens of kilometers.
That's true.
Even theoretically. Then to pinpoint a particular tree, that they must have also a visual-based landmark map, which is
yes,
not on the list here.
You are right. I'm speaking now of large-scale maps for large-scale navigation. There certainly birds cannot perform pinpoint navigation that we know they are capable of performing without recognizing visual patterns, landmarks, not necessarily visual landmarks. They might use also other sensory landmarks, but as long as we are speaking of navigation across hundreds and thousands of kilometers, I mean global navigation on global scale, and as we have mentioned that it doesn't need to be truly global. I mean, chief chaff or a chaffinch that breeds and winters within Europe may survive without being able to navigate in South America. It's not impossible for such a bird. But across the range of the particular population and maybe slightly beyond, for the case it is displaced. I'm going now to present the available data that suggests that at least some songbirds do use the magnetic map. But at first I'd like to say a couple of words about the methods. Henrik already mentioned them. Emlyn funnels, and the fact that we bird people have the ability, they have a chance to take our birds into the lab and test them, their orientation preference under the controlled conditions, is the reason why we know much more about avian navigation and orientation mechanisms than about orientation navigation mechanism of other animals who also migrate, but it is more than just one bit challenging to put a whale or a shark into an equivalent of an Emlyn funnel. And that's why we don't know much about them. And bats, they are not active in round arenas during their migration. They're smart enough to realize that they are not moving anywhere. That's why we cannot test bats in a similar situation, and that's why we know less about their orientation mechanism and cues they're using. And Henrik has already emphasized how noisy Emlyn funnel data are, and for a comparison, I have the data of free-flying, radio-tagged free-flying song thrushes, and you can see free-flying birds that were not induced to take off, but just took off with radio tags, but they took off on their own. You see how concentrated their vanishing directions are. So in the wild, they do something like this, and in the cage, they do something like this. And this is certainly a problem because you need to perform many tests, and your expected angles should be different enough, because if you have an expected difference of 30 degrees, you'll probably be never able to detect the existing difference just because of the method you are using. And then I just wanted to show you what the birds really do in Emlyn funnels, how it looks like in reality. It promises me, the computer promises me that it's going to. Can you see anything? Yes. Yes, this is what a bird really does. It is a videotape, and then you can use the traditional funnels, or you can analyze these videotapes. It's up to you. And if you need a temporal resolution, then you may want to use videos. If you don't need it really, you can use old school Emlyn funnels without video. And now I'm going to talk about the geomagnetic field and how it is or may be used for long distance navigation, for long distance maps. You have seen this picture already, and I'm not going to explain it in any much detail. I just want to emphasize that there are two most important primary features of the magnetic field. It is the inclination angle, which varies. So inclination is the angle between the magnetic inclination is the angle between the field lines and the horizontal plane. It's 90 degrees at magnetic poles and 0 at the magnetic equator, and this is the definition of the magnetic equator, which does not coincide exactly with the geographical equator, just like the magnetic poles are not exactly located at geographical poles. And you can see how it varies. These are the isolines of magnetic inclination, and you can see that even though there are some irregularities, but generally these isolines run very close to parallel to geographic parallels. So these parameters theoretically, if you can measure it, can give you the north-south axis. And then another important parameter is the total intensity of the geomagnetic field. It's roughly, it's also some variation, but roughly the field is twice as strong near magnetic poles as on the magnetic equator. And then this is how these parameter varies. And you can see that in some areas it is more or less parallel to geographic parallels and to isolines of inclination. And in some areas it runs along the north-south axis. And then it forms a nice grid. I mean, the grid that Eric showed us yesterday in the southern Indian Ocean, it was a very nice special case. It is really a nice special case. I mean, seabirds that have to navigate southern Indian Ocean, they are in a very privileged position because they really have a B-coordinate grid close to be really perpendicular. But I mean, it's not like this everywhere on Earth. Say if you superimpose these isolines, you can see that in some areas it's fine. In some areas, these lines run parallel to each other and do not form a grid. And in some areas, they run under an angle which is not 0, but not 90 degrees either. And our Swedish colleagues from Lund, they made a very nice analysis. They just looked at the angles under which the isolines intersect, and they assumed, it is just a guess, but I think it's a fair guess, that when the isolines intersect at degrees exceeding 30 degrees, it can be used for B-coordinate navigation. Certainly 90 degrees is perfect. It's Cartesian coordinates, but it doesn't need to be Cartesian 90 degrees. And so these areas are shaded green in this map. Yellowish are the areas where the angle is between 3 and 30 degrees. So it is more or less okay. And red areas are where the angle between the isolines is less than 3 degrees, and where it is really very, very challenging to use a purely magnetic map for B-coordinate navigation. So you see that fairly large numbers of our planet are shaded green. Many areas are yellowish, where it is maybe possible. but birds migrate also in the areas which are red. So they somehow find a solution, and we'll talk about this solution later on, or what solution it might be, based on the magnetic properties. But this is just for you to have an idea where the magnetic map can be used for long-range navigation and where purely magnetic map and where it would be a challenge. And now we need to say a couple of words about how birds perceive the magnetic field. Henrik is going to talk quite a lot about the molecular mechanisms that underlie magnetoreception. I'm now going to say only very basic things, and it is believed that birds have two different separate magnetoreceptor systems. This was very unexpected, but it seems that birds have two systems that are based on different physical principles, and that are innervated by different nerves and processed in different parts of their brains. And a lot of research is being done concerning the system, which is believed to be based on vision and is believed to be based physically on light-dependent chemical reactions that probably occur in avian retina. And this is known, this vision-based magnetic sense that the birds have is believed to be used for the magnetic compass. And Henrik will talk about it a lot. And I'm not going to talk about this magnetoreceptor system at all. And there is another magnetoreceptor system which people believed is located somewhere in birds' beaks, and probably it is, but we know less about it than we thought some time ago. And this magnetoreceptor system is believed to be based on iron particles, on iron oxide particles, and it is definitely not necessary for the magnetic compass to operate. A magnetic compass, as Henrik with people from his lab was able to show, the magnetic compass can operate without information from this system, and this system transmits information into the brain through the trigeminal nerve, and people think that this magnetic information might be used for the magnetic positioning system, and I'll show you why people think so. So some time ago, people thought that they found the receptor. Colleagues from the University of Frankfurt, Gert and Günther Fleissner, assumed that they found iron-containing cells in the upper beaks of pigeons, and they believed that these cells were co-localized with neuronal markers, and they even produced a model of how a receptor could look like, and it looked very nice. It really looked nice. Two receptors. This receptor innervated by the ophthalmic branch of the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve. Everything's fine. And then they were able. This is a photograph of a pigeon beak from below. They were able to find. They thought that they saw three points. 6, because 3 at each side, and they assumed that they were responsible for the three dimensions. So it looked like, and then people made very nice ideas how action potential could be generated. There were several models. I mean, some model suggested that the magnetic field triggered movements of a superparamagnetic clusters, and which induced deformation in the membrane and opening of ion channels, and thus generation of action potentials. In some models, these particles were physically connected to the membrane, in others not, and everything was very fine. But it seems that this story was just too nice to be true. And people from Vienna were able to show that 97% of these iron-containing cells in pigeon upper beaks had nuclei, which rules out these cells being dendrites. No way. And then they also were able to prove that at least 94 of these cells were macrophages, which are known to be depots for iron, and they were not localized in specific clusters along the beak. And I mean, the story collapsed. And this is a picture from Hendrik's review, which shows that there are no 6 specific locations, but a diffuse distribution of these iron-containing cells. They probably have nuclei. They have ferritin-containing siderosomes and not magnetite spherules. So it seems we thought that we had the receptor, and it seems that we don't. And this is, I mean, for hardcore sensory physiologists, it's really a no-no. When you cannot show the receptor, well, what are you talking about? However, it seems that it does not, I mean, these results do not mean that there is no magnetoreceptor which transmits information into the brain through the trigeminal nerve. Because there are some behavioral data showing that pigeons could be trained to find food based on the presence or absence of a strong magnetic anomaly, only if their trigeminal nerves were intact. I mean, the pigeons could discriminate between presence and or absence of the strong magnetic anomaly if they had their trigeminal nerves intact. When they had their olfactory nerves sectioned but trigeminal nerves intact, they were still much better than chance. And when they had their trigeminal nerve sectioned, they were down to the chance level. So it seems that they, in order to be able to discriminate to perceive the magnetic anomaly, they needed to have intact trigeminal nerves. And also, it has been shown that by Dominic Hayers and other people from Hendrik's lab, it was shown that magnetic superstimulus, I mean, superstimulus is a very strong, constantly changing magnetic field. It caused activation in the trigeminal nuclei in the brain of European robins, and it was shown by the expression of early genes, and which indicates that this particular brain area is active. And when robins with intact trigeminal nerves were given strong magnetic superstimulus, I mean strongly and chaotically changing magnetic field, they had above baseline activation, I mean significantly above baseline activation in the nuclei of the trigeminal, in the specific nuclei that are innervated by the trigeminal nerve, when the same birds were in the zero magnetic field, true zero magnetic field, their activation was down to the baseline level, and when the trigeminal nerve was sectioned, it was the same, it was down to the baseline level. So it seems that magnetoreceptors, which we, yes please.
Sorry, yeah, just with the highest paper, were you saying that the magnetic levels they were using for testing were much higher than kind of the natural levels of magnetism that you would find?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Not really.
Okay.
So the exact stimulus was 5 minutes of Earth strength magnetic field that changed approximately 90 degrees every 30 seconds. These were Earth strength fields where we intentionally did not correct for the small inaccuracy in the coil, so the intensities will have changed a few hundred nanotesla. So that's like a very natural stimulus. Then after that we had 5 minutes of the magnetic field on the 3 axes changing from 0 to 70,000 nanotesla on each axis randomly. And this results in field between almost 0 in some cases up to 140,000 nanotesla. So that's basically very strongly changing in all parameters, and that switched every 5 minutes. We switched those 2 stimulus with new randomization. And the thinking behind that stimulus is that maybe birds are interested actually in small changes in intensity or inclination, or changes in direction of Earth strength fields, or it depends on how the sensor works, and we don't know that. So it could be that a stronger stimulus where everything changes a lot is a better stimulus. So therefore we alternated those every 5 minutes to maximize the chance of activating magnetic receptors.
Thank you, Henrik. And anyway, the birds needed intact trigeminal nerve for this activation to occur in the brain, and it was first done in robins, and now there are data published on pigeons and northern wheatears, and they show the same pattern, so it seems to be a very robust phenomenon. Yes, please.
Has anyone done like acute cultures of trigeminal sensory neurons and applied magnetic fields in a petri dish to see if you get some kind of signal?
Sorry?
If you do an acute culture, if you actually dissect out the trigeminal without destroying the nerve endings, you could actually put it in a petri dish, record from it, and show that it's activated in response to a magnetic field. Has anyone tried something like that?
No, don't think so.
There is nobody has tried that, but there's a challenge with that because those neurons are very, very long, and they all have their nuclei in this ganglion, the red dot on the left. This is like at the entrance of the brain.
Yeah.
So they would be very, very difficult to get out intact.
In mouse models of chronic pain, people do this a lot where they have the whole foot attached all the way up to the spinal cord.
Wow.
It's the same thing. It's a very long structure, so it's
Okay.
definitely possible to do.
Okay, nobody has done that.
So it seems that trigeminal associated magnetoreceptors, they do exist, even though we have to admit that yes, please.
Sorry. Has somebody tried to do electrophysiology in the region that are innervated by the trigeminal nerve? And
Oh, yes.
activate
Oh,
the
yes.
region?
Oh yes, people have tried it and they had positive results. The problem is that when you are doing electrophysiology and your stimulus is change of the magnetic field, you generate the electric current. And then it is extremely difficult to be really sure that what you are observing are not the artifacts from your setup, and but real responses. And some people have done this and published this relatively high, and then very serious labs have done a lot trying to replicate these findings, and they were not believing their own results. So it doesn't mean that, I would say this is notoriously difficult.
But this is if you switch instantaneously the magnetic field. But if you have slowly varying magnetic fields, like Wu and Dickman did. If you really slowly rotate the magnetic field, then you can have DC shift, but you shouldn't have artifacts that look like spikes. So
Probably. So I'm not saying I'm not.
Wu and Dickman can't replicate their own findings.
that's a different thing. But I'm saying this is the way to go. If you're worried about artifacts, then don't have a jump in the magnetic field, but have it slowly vary.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a neurophysiologist, so if someone is going to overcome these technical challenges, it will definitely not be myself. But I think that it's doable. I think that it's doable. The question is how difficult it is. So it seems that these magnetoreceptors exist, but their structure and function have not been known. And what concerns structure, I know that people are working on that, but I'm not a histologist, and again, people who are going to find these structures, that will be definitely not myself, but I can do something about their function, because I can do behavioral tests. And this is just to mention that it's possible to condition pigeons in the lab for the change of inclination and intensity, and birds can perceive. It has been shown in lab experiments that pigeons, they can perceive intensity and inclination of the field. Whether they're really using it for navigation is a different question, Anna. I'm not saying that they are necessarily using it, but they can perceive it. And I worked with another model. I worked with Eurasian reed warblers, and these are the birds. And and then I'll show you how we were able to show that these guys, they very probably use the magnetic map, and they use the information that is transmitted by the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve for their navigation. And now someone asked, how do you choose a study species? And this is a nice example, because no one has used reed warblers for orientation experiments before myself. But reed warbler has a very interesting breeding distribution in Europe. It is common in this area. It is not a rare bird. You can capture them in Rybachi on the Baltic coast in reasonable numbers. It is so common that it is not a protected species, so it is not vulnerable. It is just a common species, not red listed. So it's possible to get a permit for working with them. And they breed. This is roughly their breeding distribution. They do not go very far east. They are really Western European species. There is another subspecies breeding in Kazakhstan, but it's another subspecies. We're not interested in it. So what we did, we captured them on the Baltic coast, and we know from breeding recoveries that birds that migrate in spring through our area, they breed here. This is known from breeding recoveries. And we tested them in emblem funnels during 3 consecutive years, and they showed a very nice northeasterly orientation in emblem funnels, which was consistent with what they are supposed to do in spring. And then we physically displaced them by plane to Zvenigorod Biological Station of Moscow University. And when they were displaced, they were surely east or southeast of their migratory goal. I mean, with robins, you cannot do that. Well, with robins, you need to go very far, because robins, they breed all the way here. And I could bring them to a place where the facilities were available, and this place was east. So, I mean, if the birds do not detect the displacement, if they are ignorant of the displacement, they should continue showing northeasterly orientation in emblem funnels. And if they detect the displacement, they should either go back west or northwest if they correct not to the capture site but to their goal. And these two directions are sufficiently different to be separable in Emlyn funnels. And this is why we have chosen this particular species and not garden warblers, because garden warblers also breed here, also east of the Urals. And what we got, they indeed corrected for the displacement, and they corrected towards their migratory goals, and not so they somehow realized where they were, and they realized where their goal was. And these were intact birds, physically displaced. And what we did next, we asked ourselves whether they need trigeminally transmitted information to be able to do this. And then we did the similar experiment, but half of the birds that we transported to Moscow had their trigeminal nerve surgically ablated, and half of the birds were sham operated. And certainly we had data from the previous experiment on intact birds. We didn't need to do intact birds again. And the result was that trigeminally ablated birds were not correcting for the displacement. And I think that this is a very important result, because if they were randomly oriented, everyone could have said, you have debilitated your birds so much that they no longer know where they are. So the birds were fit enough to show spontaneous nocturnal migratory restlessness, and they were also oriented. But they were oriented but they were just doing the same as they were doing before the displacement. Sham section birds were, unfortunately, ideally they should be doing exactly the same as intact birds. We interpreted it as sham section birds being not statistically different after displacement, but not statistically different from intact birds, and real ablated birds were statistically different from intact birds. But certainly, the shams behaving not quite perfectly is one of the reasons why this paper is in PLOS ONE and not in a more posh journal. Yes, please.
Where did you do the surgery? In the capture site or in the...
No, we did the surgery at the capture site before the displacement. The birds were ablated, then they rehabilitated, and were displaced. So, yes?
I understand correctly that you don't have, I'm just reading what's written, that you have surgery before displacement and also after displacement, and there's no difference, so that...
We only did surgery before the displacement, and probably it would be a nice thing to have another group ablated after the displacement, but we didn't do that. And I can say that it was also logistically challenging study, because reed warblers, they have a short migratory period. We can capture them in decent numbers since the 10th of May. We need to do tests at the capture site. We need to ablate them. We need to give them some time for rehabilitation, displace them, test them again, and after the 10th of June, they just stop being active. It is really, it is for every student who is learning about annual cycles, it is very, on the 7th of June, they're perfectly oriented. On the 8th of June, not really, and since the 9th of June, they stop. Just like turning a switch. So we're very limited in time. We can only work during, say, 1 month for doing this experiment. So at least our data suggest that trigeminal nerve transmits navigational information into the brain of reed warblers, and we thought that we could test whether this information was magnetic in the light of previous findings, that trigeminal nerve transmits magnetic information into the brain of admittedly other birds, because these studies were not done in reed warblers. So what we did, we used merit coils. We magnetically displaced the birds. And we were not the first ones to do that. People have done magnetic displacements before. There are data from Australia with Australian silverise that were migrating during Australian autumn, so our spring, from their Tasmanian breeding quarters to winter quarters in northern Australia. And they were captured in Armidale, and they were oriented towards the north, towards their winter quarters. And when they were magnetically displaced to northern locations, they behaved differently, but it was, in this particular case, they were disoriented because this confidence ellipse includes 0. And there were other experiments when people captured its spring. This time it's European spring, lesser white-throats in Sweden, and magnetically displaced them towards the south to Czechia, and towards the north beyond their breeding range to Norway. And the result was that birds magnetically displaced to Czechia was still oriented towards the north, and birds displaced towards the but still oriented towards the north, and the birds displaced to Norway were disoriented. But every time when the response to a treatment is disorientation, one can claim non-specific stress effects. And it's difficult to say something against this interpretation. It can be a non-specific stress effect. So what we did, we displaced the birds to Zvinigorod magnetically, where we knew, yes?
I don't agree about that. I think that if there is a random distribution, it is not necessarily indicating a stress effect.
Anna, I completely agree with you. Unfortunately, not every reviewer agrees with that.
It can happen two things. Either the birds go in a direction different from the goal, and they have some kind of nonsense orientation, because it has been demonstrated and shown repeatedly on many species, and because also sometimes the animals are attracted by some particular local feature when released in the field. But it happens that the birds are disoriented because each bird takes a different direction, and so this does not mean necessarily stress.
Anna, I agree, and I try to think positive. But many people, many nasty reviewers would say you cannot rule out a non-specific effect, and then.
So if they are disoriented, they tell you, well, but they are oriented in a different direction, and so maybe the effect is not. So there is a problem.
I do not disagree. I do not disagree with you. But yes, please.
I think there are ways you could exclude that the birds are stressed, right? You can document their behavior. You can look at maybe something like cortisol levels, and that could counteract that. You could look for, are they really
I would also say that when the birds, what we are studying is spontaneous nocturnal activity in captivity. And if the birds are really stressed, and it happens from time to time, we don't need to tell it to authorities, to animal welfare authorities, but it does happen. And then we know what happens. They do not show restlessness. They just sit on the bottom of the animal funnel. But I agree. But the fact is that many colleagues disagree, many reviewers disagree, and in order to persuade them, it is better to have a predictable reorientation, because then I would say that it's a stronger argument, even though I agree that disorientation, so a different behavior, is an argument in itself. I agree with that. Yes,
I just want to say it might not be stress, it could be pain, because in pain research, the way that you create chronic pain models is you sever either the trigeminal, peripheral afferent, or branch, or from dorsal ganglion, peripheral nerves, and that's what you're doing to the
well,
birds.
we...
It could be something like that.
well, the birds are anesthetized. I mean, certainly when during their operation they're anesthetized.
Oh, yeah. It's just after, it's autoplasticity that induces from ectopic nerve firing.
Again, it's theoretically possible, but again, I mean, a bird is rarely ill. A bird has a songbird. They're either fine or dead. And the period of time between being fine and being dead is notoriously short. And another thing is that, again, if the birds are stressed, in pain, I mean really seriously inconvenienced, they would not be active in ambient funnels, because this is an activity which is shown spontaneously by the animals that are feeling quite okay.
Well, I don't know, I did a lot of mouse research, and they're prey animals, so they don't display when they actually are in a state of chronic pain, but you can actually behaviorally determine that they do have chronic pain, they're just not showing it the way that we do. Basically.
And then, well, you may claim that it's panic, but then it will be, I would find it a very unlikely coincidence that a panicked bird shows activity in the direction consistent with migratory reorientation and using a map that I'm going to show you just now. So things do happen, but I would say that it is a rather unlikely coincidence.
So, to comment about this, what can you make out of disoriented distribution? So I guess two comments. One is that if you look at the individual animals and see whether they are still showing consistent orientation, but just between the animals is different, I think that'll be a stronger argument, because if there's some stress effect, you're likely they'll just most of the time do nothing. So I think looking at the individual animal is important as opposed to this group phenomenon. And secondly, just as a comment, it doesn't have to be stress. It could be that this nerve transmits whatever temperature information, and you sever it, and then they think it's too hot or too cold, and they don't feel like migrating. I mean, you just confuse them. Doesn't have to be stress, but you all sorts of confusion effects, right? So, and I agree with the reviewers in this respect. It's hard to argue against something like that.
And I can tell you that in all the experiments, in the experiments I have shown you before, what people did, I mean, in these experiments and in these experiments, what people did, they kept the birds just in the normal aviary. They took it to the funnel, which was in the altered field, tested it, took it back into the aviary with the normal field, ambient field. Then next night they took it again to the altered field, and they did it several times. And if the bird indeed used the magnetic parameters for their positioning, it is equivalent of taking an animal, displacing it instantaneously 1,000 kilometers, then back, then forth again, and if
very confusing experience.
Yes. And if some of your senses is sending you impossible information, one idea to cope with it is to ignore this sense. And what we did, we kept the birds within the coils throughout the experiment. We changed the field only once. And then we had to test them during several nights, and during all of this time, the birds remained within the altered field. And you can see how the coils look like. We had to take the birds out of the cages and put them on top in ambient funnels without taking them out. And as a result, you can see that there is no much space between this table and the coils, and I do not fit in. I could only accept rather slim students to do this work, which is well, but it is, you see how it looks like.
I have a question, I think. So, did you use for this, you used only juvenile or adult, or is
it was spring, and for the purposes of navigation, all these birds were adults. They were all returning. I mean, in reed warblers in spring, you cannot safely separate second-year birds and older birds, but for the purposes of navigation experience, they have all been born somewhere in the Baltics, went down to Africa, and were returning now. So they were all experienced in spring. And we put the birds into the coils, and we simulated the magnetic parameters typical of that area, and everything, all the other parameters were typical of the Curie spit. So they had the same photoperiod, they experienced the same odors, they experienced the same stars, the same landscape, everything was the same, only the magnetic field was changed. And this is how it looked like on the dunes. And the result was that the response to the magnetic displacement was indistinguishable from the results of the real displacement. So we could magnetically displace birds, really. I mean, everything was the same, only the magnetic field was changed, and we changed all the parameters. We simulated the magnetic conditions of a remote site, and the birds behaved exactly the same in the sense of migratory orientation, emerald funnels, as if they were really displaced to that site. And we think that this is a rather strong argument in favor of the magnetic basis of the navigational map, at least in reed warblers. And now I want to show you this map, this analysis again. And you see that we are on the border between yellowish and green. So in our area, it should probably work with inclination and intensity alone, or it might work, but there are also other areas where birds do navigate. People also live, but birds do navigate. And here, with these two parameters, it is theoretically not possible to do that. And then one possibility is to use magnetic declination. And magnetic declination is actually the difference between the geographic north and magnetic north. And we know from Henrik's talk that birds have both star compass, so celestial compasses that provide them with the geographic north, and they have a magnetic compass, which provides them with magnetic north. And then the question is, so theoretically, it should be possible for the birds to take the two regions and to compare them. But, well, theoretically possible and experimentally demonstrated are two different things. And why is declination so tempting? It's because it varies along the east-west axis exactly in the areas that are problematic from the viewpoint of inclination and intensity. So it would be a very nice solution. And I just want to show you. It's a bit slow because now I can show you that how nice grid is formed by magnetic inclination and declination. You see, it's a very nice grid. This is a presumed migratory path, migratory route of a reed warbler, and you can see that if they can use declination, it would be great for them. And we did an experiment. Declination and yes, thank you. Sorry. It's declination and intensity. And if they could use declination, it would solve the problem. It would provide birds. Yes, please.
Yeah, just a short question. You showed them that they're migrating between the Baltic coast and further to the east in Russia. Now you're saying they go to Africa. So
in spring, so this is in autumn they go to Africa. Okay. In spring they go further to Russia, but not very far, which was the reason why we have chosen these birds. But they go to the north or northeast in spring, and towards the south in autumn, and they're long-distance migrants. They all winter in sub-Saharan Africa. They might not go further south of the equator, but they definitely cross the Sahara.
Nikita, how does this look in Australia, for instance, where the inclination and intensity lines are almost parallel there too? Is it a similar? Do you have a map of that?
Sorry. It is.
Was on the slide just
I must have been right and curiously missed it. Sorry.
You see, in Australia,
perfect.
it's also fine.
Absolutely.
So.
Sir.
Yeah.
So this seems to migrate in a trajectory that's always on top of regions in which you have both, right, the lines, red and blue. I mean, they are not passing anymore in, for example, in Africa, where you have only regions with one coordinate, according to this map.
I mean, this is how our populations migrate. Yeah. Birds also do migrate here, and here it will be. You see, it will be confusing for the eastern population. There is an eastern subspecies. I mean, this is another subspecies, Acrocephalus capacius fuscus, that goes down to East Africa. But you see, as Henrik mentioned, there is probably no single solution which is good for every avian species on this planet. But at least for Western European populations of reed warblers, using declination would be a solution, and for many other birds too. But I agree that there are places on Earth where this is not a solution, and where birds need to use, and other migrating animals need to use other cues. And we really did an experiment. In autumn this time, we changed declination. And what does it mean to change declination? Also in merit coils. We just rotated the north. We only rotated the horizontal component of the magnetic field 8.5 degrees towards the left, anti-clockwise, because we have 5.5 degrees in Rubaci, and if you just rotate 8.5 degrees, you have -3 degrees, and it will correspond. It is a coincidence, but it will correspond an existing location. The vicinity of the town Dundee in Scotland has exactly the same inclination and intensity as Rubaci, but they have a different declination.
So in other animals aside from birds that might have a polarity compass, how would you distinguish between an animal that's using a polarity compass and declination?
In this particular case, I'm not speaking of compass at all, but you see, if you have a technical compass, how do you know which end is north and which end is south?
Based on the polarity, right?
No, it is based on the fact that someone has painted the north end.
Oh, it's okay.
If you have just a needle, not painted by anyone, it will just point downwards, and in the northern hemisphere, it will be oriented along the north-south axis. And you will know that in the northern hemisphere, the axis which is pointing downwards is north. When you go to Australia, you have the same compass, the same needle, and the end which will be pointing downwards will be pointing towards south. So only painting one end of the needle makes it a polarity compass.
Nah, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, if you have a single magnetite crystal, it will have a polarity, and so for that, that's like painting. It depends on how the biophysics of a crystal would give you. There will be a difference. If you change the polarity, this crystal would change by 180 degrees, and if it's attached to something inside the cell, you would definitely
then yes,
that's certainly possible. But I think your question went in a different direction. I think that what you are saying is that, of course, now we are changing here the magnetic field 8.5 degrees counterclockwise. So the compass response of these animals should now be shifted by 8.5 degrees. That's of course far below the resolution that we have in
animal funnels. You can never detect it.
You cannot detect it. Okay. So if your response would be 8.5 degrees, it would just be a compass response. But and then Nikita will tell you it's not 8.5 degrees.
Yes, I mean the adults. I mean these are the directions shown by adults and juveniles at the capture site. Well, they were all tested in the capture site, but in the ambient field, and they were oriented towards the west-southwest, which is the normal migratory direction in autumn in our area. And when we magnetically when we change declination or magnetically displace them to Scotland, where they have never been, adults responded by changing their direction by 150 degrees. You can see that, I mean, this is obviously not a compass response, because compass response would have been only 8.5 degrees and undetectable in the in animal funnels, and juveniles were perfectly disoriented, which is interesting, because I mean, if they were only relying on their compass and clock, they would be expected not to respond at all. And it seems that even though they were migrating for the first time in their lives, they had some expectation what declination should be. And adults, they have not been in Scotland before, because the Baltic reed warblers do not migrate through the British Isles, but they most probably had experienced negative declinations in Africa during their previous migration. And from declination, they could tell that they are either far in the west or in the south, but intensity and inclination obviously were wrong for a southern location. So it suggested a western location and reorientation towards the east-southeast.
So I'm a bit confused about the declination. How can you use that? Because it's the angle between the geographical north and the magnetic north. Now, if you're in northern Canada, then the difference is big, and then it's useful. But if you're talking here about a difference in Ribaci, it's 5 degrees, and in Scotland it's -2 degrees, so it's 7 degrees, and you assume that they are able to detect both the northern star, rotating stars, I guess, or sunset or something, some geographical information, and the magnetic compass to within a very high precision. So it will, I mean, except at very, polar regions, this is a very, very small difference.
Well,
the point shows that it's perpendicular to the intensity, but it's a very, very small signal.
I agree. Well, I do assume that they're able to use their compasses with a precision of around 1 degree or better. Because I would argue that a compass with an uncertainty of 10-15 degrees would be as useless as no compass at all.
But the parabolas that Henrik has shown us is not 1 degree precision, it's worse than that.
Okay, but there are many, many factors going into those training recoveries. This is, of course, a bird only flies 10 meters per second. So on most days, at the height they are flying, the winds are stronger than their flying speed. So they are, of course, affected by winds, Of course, there is a distribution in the individual birds' inherited direction. So they are not all inheriting 212 degrees. I think that's unrealistic. Likewise, but it's probably not much spread there either. And then, of course, there are the mistakes you are making. There are many, many things that go into the ring recoveries, which does not mean that the sensory system in principle cannot detect a very specific direction. Because if you look at the star, if you ask you to go out, even though you don't need to use it, you have to point to the North Star. Once you know the geometry of the North Star, your precision is a degree. I mean, no problem. I mean, it's very easy to do that.
But what you say is that, you know, then the variation that is seen across the population could be due to kind of individual differences. This just points to me again the importance of tracking an individual animal, you know, with GPS and seeing if they are growing straight within 1 degree. I mean, this would be the answer.
No, but they will not, because there are all kinds of other factors that will grow them up.
This will be at least indication of how good, like an upper limit on how good they can be.
Yes, please.
So are you planning to do the opposite, like change the declination by changing the star pattern? That would be the obvious experiment, right?
Well, in order to change declination by changing the star pattern, I need to go to a planetarium.
Yeah, or use like the simplified version with the lights that Henrik showed.
That's a very logistically challenging experiment. Hand-raising enough birds to get significant results of something like that is a huge challenge, practically.
And I am also, I can say that I'm more cautious than Henrik about artificial patterns. I want to, as long as it's possible to work under the real sky, I really want to do that. Anna.
Did you try to put some shield for overcast, to create an overcast, so that they cannot see the stars?
Well, in these experiments, we were specifically looking at the effect of declination, whether change in declination would change the situation. And therefore, we tested them under open skies and without milky glass.
Yeah, but to see whether it's really declination, you need to exclude the possibility to detect the geographic north.
Yes,
and
yes.
In the geographic north, you can detect it only if you look
Yes,
at the
yes,
stars.
yes, certainly. You need celestial cues.
So it would be really nice to show that if they cannot see the stars, they are disoriented or oriented.
There is another logistic problem, and the problem is that you need to deprive them of the view of the sky not only during the test itself, but also throughout the period of keeping them, because they may detect that they may decide that they are displaced towards the west before actual test, and move and decide to move towards the east-southeast, and then maintain this east-southeasterly direction on the basis of the magnetic compass, which is available to them. So in order to do this, I would need to keep them without access to the sky, to the view of the sky, throughout the experiment after the magnetic displacement. And then the problem is that specifically reed warblers, when they don't see the sky for a long period of time, they stop being oriented. We have tried this, and we know that if you keep them indoors for a long period of time, so for 5 days, 3 days, well, 3 days maybe not yet, but for 5 days, 7 days, they're disoriented.
Well, indoor I can understand, but I don't think if you put some opaque glass or dog or plastic, whatever,
In order
to simulate overcast, I mean, not to show them the stars or a screen, whatever. I mean, then you have really the evidence that it's declination, it's a matter of declination, because then they cannot detect the geographic north.
I agree. I still think that even in this experiment, it could only be declination because it was the only parameter that we changed. But there was no other parameter changed, except of declination. But I agree that it will be possible to put to put milky glass on top of the eminal funnel, but I'm afraid that the results would be not necessarily conclusive of this experiment. But we can talk about it later, because I have no time and I need to skip large parts of my talk, but I just wanted to emphasize that magnetic maps are used not only by the birds. There are some nice data showing that loggerhead turtles that are, and these are hatchling loggerhead turtles that need to stay within the North Atlantic gyre, and when people from North Carolina simulated magnetic conditions at different locations of the North Atlantic gyre, the hatchling turtles responded by swimming in the direction that would keep them within the gyre and not being transported to the North Atlantic, where they would die. There are also data on green turtles that responded in a predictable way to the magnetic displacement in similar experiments. There is a recent paper on eels that are claimed to respond by swimming into different directions to magnetic displacements. There are also data suggesting that newts use a magnetic map, and these results are truly impressive and unexpected, because newts never move beyond 1, 2, 3 kilometers. And magnetic map varies on a spatial scale, a much greater spatial scale. So, the results are here, but it is very difficult to imagine how these animals could have developed a magnetic map, given the spatial range of their movements. And there are also data with spiny lobsters, and again, these animals that don't move that much were also able to respond in a predictable way. And I can say that it is more than just one bit embarrassing that we bird people obtained relatively good evidence for migratory birds using magnetic map after turtle people have obtained their data, because the first suggestion that birds may use a magnetic map dates back to 1859. It was only a suggestion back then, but it took us more than 150 years to produce experimental evidence, and people working with other groups of animals were faster. So it's a bit embarrassing, I should say. And then there is another thing, and the thing is that magnetic map is changing. And this is one reason why, and then there is a question of precision of the magnetic maps. And this is an example of a turtle that needs to get back to breed on the Ascension Island. And with turtles that lay their eggs on the coast on the continental coast, it might be less of a problem, because when they return after 25 years to lay their eggs, they would be just shifted by, say, 100 kilometers or 150 kilometers. Well, it's not too good, maybe, but it's not a disaster. And for a turtle that lays its eggs on a small oceanic island, it will be a disaster, but it will be not able to find its island. And this is a map that shows a magnetic isoline that runs from Brazil, where these turtles forage and spend their time. And this is the situation in 85, and this is the situation in 2010. And now, after 25 years, the isoline doesn't cross the island any longer. It has shifted. However, people have modeled this situation, and they assume that if there is a waterborne odor plume that emanates from the island, the magnetic isoline would be still sufficient not to hit the island, but to hit this plume. And in this particular case, it would be a solution, but it would then mean that a turtle needs a two-step navigation, because it would not be able to find the island on the basis of its memorized magnetic parameters alone. It would only able to find the more or less general vicinity. And with the spatial resolution of the magnetic map, I want to show you this paper, this review. I came into orientation and navigation from ecology. I did my PhD on stopover ecology of migrating birds and identify myself as a bird migration person with a special emphasis on orientation navigation. And because of that, I know a couple of papers from the field of ecology, and I think that spatial scaling is very important not only in ecology, but also in the study of animal movement and orientation navigation. And what we did recently, we looked at the data of how magnetic parameters vary over time. There are very nice data sets freely available to anyone from the magnetometric stations. They measure since 91, and they measure the magnetic field every minute. And we took, I won't go into details, but this is an example of a data from a Nurmijärvi station not very far from Helsinki. And you can see how it varied from 91 to 2015. And these are fluctuations between minimal and maximal values, and this is total field intensity. And variation is not negligible, and our analysis, I won't go into much details, but our analysis shows that a pied flycatcher that imprints or remembers magnetic parameters somewhere in southern Finland that would try to return on the basis of the magnetic information alone next spring, because of there is also, as you can see, there is also a trend, which is maybe less of a problem for birds, but is a problem for long-lived animals like turtles. Over 25% will return within -20, -8 kilometers, which means that they will not reach their destination. They will need to fly a little further. And 81% will return to within 26 kilometers. And it's a bit different in different parts of the world, because the gradients are more steep or less steep. But even assuming perfect measurements of the magnetic parameters, no animal will be able to navigate with a pinpoint accuracy. They must, and in real world certainly, they cannot remember the value perfectly, and they cannot measure the value perfectly. I mean, this was the best case scenario with good magnetometer and perfect memory. And in reality, living animals will be worse than that, and it will mean that that they need something else. They would be able to find the area. It will vary between different areas, but as a rough approximation, 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers. And within this range, they will need to use other navigation systems, and it might be landmarks, not necessarily visual. And if I'm breeding on the Kurish Spit, it's fine, because Kurish Spit and Kurish Lagoon have very distinct topographical features. But birds are also, for instance, pied flycatchers, they show very high degrees of fidelity to their breeding areas in the center of Siberia. And I've flown into that area, it's just forest everywhere. So topographic feature, if you have found, and they're site faithful, and if you have found a square 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers, it will be a challenge. They will need something else. It might be olfactory map at this, I don't know, but it cannot be magnetic map alone. It is ruled out on the physical grounds. We cannot do anything. I mean, the geomagnetic field is as it is, and neither we nor birds can change it.
So that would imply then that any attempt by engineers to create an alternative GPS system based only on the magnetic field of the Earth is doomed to failure.
At least you won't be able to drive a car with such a navigation system. It might be better than nothing, but it will definitely not allow you to drive a car, or which is maybe not a too bad a thing. It will be not precise enough to be used for military purposes, because then you will hit some targets 50 kilometers from the intended target, which is not okay in the modern warfare. Yeah, some 70 years ago they thought it was okay. Okay, I'll go very fast through the end of my talk. This is the idea of clock and compass concept, and it is a paper published by Obergurgl and Wolfgang Wilczka some nearly 40 years ago, where they showed that garden warblers, hand-raised in southern Germany, they show in Emlen funnels, they showed orientation consistent with the directions that their free-flying conspecifics were taking in the wild at the same time. So in early autumn, the birds were oriented towards the southwest, when Central European garden warblers were flying towards the Iberian Peninsula or Morocco in the first part of autumn, and after that, when the free-flying conspecifics were crossing the Sahara towards the south-southeast, the birds were doing the same in Emlen funnels, and it was the paper that helped shape the clock and compass concept, saying that juvenile birds that migrate for the first time in their lives have no idea where they are. They only have a compass which tells them where to go, and maybe clock is not a very good word, I would say a calendar that tells them that you have 10 days to go this direction, and that's fine, but there are some data sets that suggest that maybe some birds do know where they are. This is a study in thrush nightingales done some 15 years ago by Swedish colleagues, who were able to show they did not use they didn't test orientation of these birds, but thrush nightingales, inexperienced migrants that had the magnetic conditions along their migratory route simulated, also down to northern Egypt. They deposited more fat and than birds that remained in the magnetic field of Sweden, and the interpretation was that they were aware of the fact that they had to cross the Sahara. And it's also a question, I mean, if you are a non-experienced migrant, how do you know when the easy part ends and you are going to cross the Sahara or the Gulf of Mexico and you cannot go on low fuel? Yes?
I think there is one important distinction of that experiment, is that this may be an inherited signpost, like an inherited value to switch a behavior. It doesn't have to be a map. This
is exactly what I'm going to say.
Sorry.
So that it does not need to be a detailed map, but it might be inherited knowledge of a beacon or a signpost that we could call it a rudimentary magnetic map, or magnetic information which is used for navigation, but not really a position finding mechanism. There is a more recent study in northern Wheatears that had not exactly the same results, but the Wheatears that remained in the magnetic field of Wilhelmshaven in northwestern Germany, they showed more migratory restlessness than the birds that had their journey magnetically simulated. And the interpretation of the authors is that these birds were aware of the fact that they were behind the schedule, which assumes that they do have a schedule. Which magnetic conditions should they meet in what parts of their first maiden journey? So it is highly unlikely that the birds or any other animals can inherit a magnetic map, because the magnetic map of your parents is clearly outdated. It's outdated even for birds, but for turtles it's definitely outdated, badly outdated. So you do not want to listen to Beatles music anymore if you are young. Maybe you do, but it's outdated. But there might be some magnetic information that is inherited and which helps, for instance, to prepare for the difficult part. And the take-home messages are that at least some birds use a geomagnetic map for long-distance migratory navigation. These are sea turtles, and probably other animals do the same. So it's not limited to birds. In birds, navigation-related magnetic information is transmitted through the trigeminal nerve. This is the embarrassing part. We don't know the receptor, which is bad. Geomagnetic field alone cannot be responsible for the navigation with the accuracy which is known for migratory birds. There must be something else. And a magnetic map needs to be learned individually and new in every generation, but some inherited signposts or beacons may exist. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and also to thank, so my feet are on the Kurish pit and my head is in the vicinity of Moscow. And I'd like to people with whom I have collaborated, some of them, and these are the ones with whom I have collaborated most. So, thank you. And